Hello and welcome to another episode of N64 Magazine Time Capsule. This episode we're taking a look at issue number 16 and this is from June of 1998 and features an awesome cover with Gex and Banjo with some cool looking reptile skin background. Oddly, I don't personally remember this issue back in the day, and so it's going to be revealing to see what's in store. A quick note however, if you're new here then make sure you're watching in full HD. That way you can pause the video and read clearly any of the articles if you're on a large enough screen, or alternatively just head to the link in the description below, which will take you to the out of print archive where you can download the PDF for this issue and many other retro gaming magazines. This month's editor letter is quite eye-opening, as James Ashton lets us know that the magazine has been in a bit of bother this past month. Without going into the specifics, he reiterates that the magazine's independent and the fact that they don't accept bribes or mutual back scratches with publishers in order to give them, well, the ability to sell more of their games. And it seems the most likely story here is that a publisher has been getting pissed off with them for some low scores, and they've probably tried to get the magazine staff on the payroll, so to speak. This month's content is packed, and the magazine scored the world exclusive of Gex 64 and is asking the all-important question if it will be a competitor for Banjo Kazooie. We also get reviews of World Cup 98 and Forsaken, as well as import reviews like Airborder 64. There's previews of Space Circus, Conker 12 Tales, and how-to guides for Yoshi and Mystical Ninja. There's also a wealth of how-to guides, from importing games to how studios try to make games great, so there's lots to see and over 100 pages to cover in this issue. Now, a preview for Gex 64 is up next, and it's clear to see that the magazine were really hyping this one up. Strangely, the magazine started off by slandering the PlayStation 1 platform game library and suggesting that Gex 64 was shaping up to be Mario 64 levels of greatness. Now sure, it looked nice and had a cool concept, but describing the controls as being putty-like were perhaps a stretch too far. The short Q&A with the game's director was interesting to see how they decided to move forward with the project, and perhaps the most interesting point for me was that in the Kung Fu levels the studio actually had poor lip syncing added to play into the joke of it being poorly dubbed like in many classic Kung Fu movies. But the playtesters assumed that the studio had actually just done a poor job of lip syncing rather than actually getting the joke that they were trying to make. So this was eventually scrapped, which was a shame. Banjo Kazooie preview gives us some interesting insight into the game right before its release. At this time, Rare confirmed the game was done and final playtesting was all that was taking place. They finally gave away the storyline of the game, which the magazine seems really interested in, and they also explain how the level system and world map looks. They also mention the levels have Jin Go birds to collect, and so it sounds like they didn't quite fully understand either the name or what the creatures are. But nevertheless, they are indicating they think this will be a game for the summer and one of the best titles that is potentially going to be released this year. Like Gex 64 before, they also have a short Q&A with the studio, and this too is full of cool pieces of info. They suggest that the first time player will likely take between 30 to 50 hours to complete the game, but once you know where everything is, it could be completed in 4 or 5 hours. The magazine states that if any game is going to be able to knock Mario 64 off its perch, then Banjo Kazooie is likely to be the game to be able to do so, and that's how impressed they were with it even from what they'd seen. Earthworm Jim is over the page and it's a much smaller piece, however the game is much earlier in its development cycle. After having scrapped the original 2.5D version of the game in favour of making a true 3D title, the studio said that they were now super happy with how the N64 version was progressing. The magazine agreed that the change to 3D was probably for the best, however with hindsight I'm sure we'd all agree that a 2.5D Earthworm Jim would have been really cool to see. Nevertheless, the magazine was impressed by how much the game had changed since they last viewed the project about 8 months before this. On a side note, the studio was currently working out of a disused NHS hospital, so how's that for a quirky working environment? Space Circus is next, and the magazine again is perhaps a little bit too excited about this title, but that appears to be because of the very unique concept design and it being yet another 3D platform game. Still though, they say it plays well and that the N64 version that they had played was near identical to the PC build of the game that they'd also seen. In addition, in the Q&A section, they also established the game's non-linear progression, which is something they say that they're also pleased to see. Turning the page gives us a triple hitter of games. Bumble appears to be etching closer to release after being in development since 1996. The first level demo had the magazine interested, but with so little to see, it was hard to tell how appealing the finished project would eventually be. 12 Tales had Rare being tight-lipped, essentially saying that they don't get badgered by publishers for release dates, so they'll talk more about it whenever they're ready to. Tonic Trouble also gets a mention, but the magazine suggests that although the PC version looks decent, the N64 console edition will be up against some massive competition, so it may struggle to find an audience. A Spot Cream ad is up next, and note the tissues on the bedside table and array of magazines, and it's clear who they were targeting with this ad. Planet 64 this month is fascinating. The magazine hails the arrival of Psygnosis on the N64 and the announcement that they're bringing WipEout to the N64, and the magazine suggests it'll be 10 times faster than the PS1 version, and early screenshots make it look incredible. To the right though is news that a sequel to GoldenEye will be revealed at E3, and that it will feature an entirely new franchise built by Rare themselves. They mention it will be a spy-based FPS, which was actually spot on, but they said that the main character was rumoured to be called Jake Bind. Now that's a long way from Joanna Dark, so it's cool to see what rumours were around basically before the game's actual announcement. We have the usual roundup of new accessories and peripherals, and the most interesting this month was the gold Nintendo 64 official controller, which the magazine jokingly states costs £99 and it comes with a free Nintendo 64 console. The game booster for £40 was also interesting, although the magazine suggests hanging on for Nintendo's own official Game Boy player, which was supposed to be released in late 1998. Planet 64 is absolutely stacked this month. First of all, there's new pics of Pocket Monster Stadium, and the magazine pretty much confirms that it appears to now be switched from being a regular kart game, having originally been planned to be an N64 DD title. Rat Attack also gets some new screenshots, and the magazine suggests it's a quirky and fun looking game, and the multiplayer mode, well, it basically seems quite promising, but given the fast speed single room antics of the single player game, they're not quite sure how it will translate into multiplayer. Rakugakids gets an exclusive for the magazine, and they pretty much summarise what the game is. A high art styled fighting game with signature special moves that Konami are suggesting is in the kawaii style and aimed at those who dig that kind of thing. Way more interesting though is the yellow column, however, which confirmed for the first time that South Park would be an FPS title. Taz 3D was in development, but also sadly that Space Jelly had quietly been cancelled. That's a shame because that was a title that sounded really unique and interesting. The studio did however confirm that they would use the assets that they'd created in the other 5 N64 titles that they were currently working on. F-Zero X gets some much needed new photos for the magazine after having gone a little quiet on the news for a while. It was certainly one of those games you had to see in action, and screenshots really didn't ever do it justice. However, it was nice seeing some of the character and craft artwork on display. The Legend of the River King gets some coverage, but naturally the magazine brushes over much of this is well, a really niche title. And Ear to the Ground on the right column confirms that Daikatana will land on N64, Nuclear Strike and Road Rash are coming from THQ, and Turok 2 will get some much needed action coverage in the next issue following E3. RPG News has Holy Magic Century, or Quest 64 as most of you will know it, slap us with some new screenshots. I couldn't help but always feel this was a rough around the edges looking game even back then, but the news is that the magazine, well, for the first time they've seen the English language version, so it pretty much confirmed that we would get a UK release. Harvest Moon 64 gets confirmed here too, and funnily enough the magazine suggests that you don't close the magazine and stop reading because a farming sim is on the way. The big Zelda news, headlined Trouble in Paradise, was that the latest news was the game had been delayed yet again until Christmas 1998 now. The magazine were quick to point out that things haven't gone the way of Mother 3, as there had always been a steady stream of photos and news, but they were nevertheless disappointed but accepted Miyamoto saying that the game would be more immersive than Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII, so it is going to be worth people's wait. The Ultra release list has the most up-to-date release schedule for the console, and as always it's been updated with newly announced games and release dates. It's always cool to look at some of the titles of projects which were never released, like Puma Street Soccer, 7th Legion and Aeon Flux. The Readers' Awards are up next, and it's no surprises that GoldenEye takes the crown here. What I do want to know is who in the hell were the 50 people who sent in votes for Nagano Winter Olympics for being the console's best game? I'm guessing it may have been some mischievous PlayStation fanboys from back in the day, as nobody in their right mind... Oh, hang on a second, it was probably just someone over at Konami's marketing department trying to get the game some free coverage. Made in Japan with Max Everingham is up next, and this month he's giving a guide on the Japanese dating game. He also brings news that Konami have snagged the rights to use the World Cup license in their latest release, which is partially why ISS 98 was delayed in both Europe and the Americas. There's also part 12 of his Learn Japanese ongoing series. Also this month, he's giving dating pickup lines, as it was reported that the majority of women under 30 in Japan were single. The GoldenEye Spymaster results are in, and the first place goes to Dutch dynamo that was Patrick Wissels. I reached out to him to see if he still has the award trophy shown on screen, but I haven't heard back yet. So keep an eye on the Facebook page, and if I do hear back from him, I will let you know and also try to get some cleaner pictures of it. Big round of applause, and this was a hotly contested competition, so some great performances for the time. Let's jump into N64 Arena now with this month's game review, starting with World Cup 98 from EA. With Road to the World Cup having only come out 7 months before this release, it's no surprise that the magazine was cautious about this being yet another cash-in title. They confirm that there are some minor changes, like being able to change the game speed and the compression technology, which makes the controls a bit more responsive. Aside from going through the game modes and a fairly thorough overview of the game, it's no surprise that they still feel it doesn't even touch ISS 64 in terms of gameplay, and that when ISS 98 lands in a few months' time, that is going to further increase the gap between what EA were releasing here and the crown owner Konami with their ISS series. 73% seems a fair score. It's an average game at best, but it does have some cool features and the commentary was pretty decent for the time. Aero Fighters Assault gets a pretty scathing review. They say it's not a bad game, but there's just so many more titles you should be checking out before you play this. They liked the concept of the game and felt that the execution was just a little bit too bland and the gameplay very repetitive. I think they were a little bit harsh, constantly comparing it to Pilot Wings, which was always a much more general public friendly release than this would ever be. Oh, and go get a copy of Film Magazine because it has a bonus CD this month with Scream 2 content. 6 pages are devoted to Forsaken this month, and you can tell by the length of the review that this was a title that they very much enjoyed. They deep dive into it as being the console's first serious game after the release of GoldenEye. They, like they did in the preview, stated that the controls are pretty bad and suggested immediately going into the options menu and changing them to something more suitable. But after that, they found the game to be an addictive experience. They suggest that anyone picking it up casually or renting it, for example, may find that it's not for them. But they suggest that's because you really need to get to grips with how the game plays to get anything from it. But when you do, it becomes an immersive experience. Likewise, they suggest that in multiplayer, you will need players of a similar mentality and skill level to you. If one thing's clear though, is that they say that this is one of the best looking and best running games on the system, and from a visual perspective, the lighting effects are something to behold. They note that the cool D&B music in the game, which is something I appreciated, and they finished off by slapping this with a Star Game Award after scoring an impressive 87%. I always loved this as I was a huge fan of Descent back in the day, and so this was a day one pickup title for me. Wayne Gretzky 3D Hockey 98 gets an impressive 70% score. I have no idea how they came to that figure because the score breakdown would have suggested a much lower score was incoming, but I suspect it's because it's basically a marginally updated version of the original, which we all know and love. They were thankful that this was actually a greater improvement than Olympic hockey was, and of course we all love this game still. Rampage World Tour on the opposite page, however, gets a weak review, and it pretty much confirms that the game feels as being dated on its release and plays incredibly retro-like, and it doesn't really bring anything new to the table to make it worth spending the full retail price on. I always felt that Rampage, well, it was a bit of a fun rental, but yeah, there's no way you'd have picked this up at the standard retail price of maybe £50 upwards or so. We move into Import Arena now, and Airborder 64 gets a poor showing at 58%. They say the similarities with 1080 snowboarding are only in the fact that both games feature an actual board. Airborder 64 is a sluggish mess with a janky camera, slow-paced gameplay and game modes which are not interesting or exciting at all. They do highlight 5 arenas where you can get some big air, but overall they found that much of the game was simply trial and error, with some coin collecting challenges simply being down to pure luck rather than any skill. Jeopardy gets reviewed with one of the worst scores in the history of the magazine. Yeah, it's bad. And remember, much of the questions in the game are based on US knowledge, and so for us Brits, a lot of the content in the game would go over our heads anyway, unless you're immensely clued up on American history and culture. The really good game prices in the ad to the right are way more interesting than Jeopardy. A cool competition to win a copy of Quake 64 is next, and the challenge is to send them in something to scare the staff members. Quite funnily, they suggest not sending them substances which come from body parts, and a reminder that making them scream is not the same as making them sick. The how-to guides are up next, and starting off we have a guide on how to live happily ever after in Yoshi's story. It's a fairly generic how-to guide with a basic overview of the core mechanics from the game, as well as tips on how to score highly in each of the game's levels, as well as a target score to beat. The guide on how to beat the bosses is probably the most useful, but it's not exactly a challenging game, and if you're only trying to play it the casual usual way by doing the story from start to finish, real ones know that the watermelon challenge is where the game really packs a skill challenge. Part 2 of the How to Complete Mystical Ninja guide is up next, and it's quite useful especially for anyone new to the game, as certain castles like the Festival Temple Castle can be quite tricky the first time you have to traverse them. The Gourmet Submarine Castle was another one which is notoriously tricky, so the overview here on how to do it will help you without completely spoiling the experience. Thankfully, the magazine doesn't spoil the game's ending, as they leave the guide on a cliffhanger for the reader to go and experience the finale themselves. The Quake how-to guide is actually quite interesting, as rather than being a guide on how to complete each level, it focuses purely on how to find every secret area in the game. Sure, some of the early levels they are quite easy to find, but as the game progressed, some of the secret areas were notoriously difficult to find. There's also an ad for Redline, which is a car enthusiast magazine, which I never personally found all that interesting, and I don't actually remember it lasting too long on shelves. The final how-to guide this month is a guide on how to choose and use an import cart converter. Now this was quite interesting back in the day, and in fact probably is even useful to this day, as every now and again I'll get questions from people asking me which import adapter they should be picking up. I'll usually always say the Passport 2 or ideally Passport 3 if you can find one. The magazine reminds people that Nintendo say the use of such carts invalidates the warranty of the console. However, they even state that they themselves use it for game reviews and have done for quite some time. In addition, they confirm that Nintendo won't actually be able to prove that you've been using one, and so just follow the standard best practice and you should be fine. Tips Extra has this month's magazine and readers' cheats, and perhaps the most interesting is the one for snowboard kids. You've probably already opened up all courses and characters anyway, but the cheat code allows you to select the same character in multiplayer, something that's not possible without the cheat. The official Nintendo hotline gives up this month's most requested calls for help, which were for 1080 snowboarding, Quake 64 and Tetrisphere. They also confirmed that they'd now doubled their staff count on the helplines and extended their weekend opening hours. There's a new automated number for help which was launched for those that didn't want to speak to a real person, but it was 50p per minute, which was hugely expensive back in the day. Thankfully, the regular helpline was just a local rate number, and so many of us who had this included free within our landline packages back in the day meant that you could ring up and annoy those helpline staff 24 hours a day and 365 days a year. The latest Skill Club 64 rankings are up next, and there's 2 people in the world who have completed all 10 challenges, so there's plenty of work for everyone else to do in the silver or bronze categories to step up their game, no pun intended. I'm the Best has the latest leaderboard rankings for this month's challenge is to beat 3 minutes 30 seconds in Top Gear Rally's Coastline course for anyone looking for a way to kill time on a new challenge. A double page of ads are up next, and randomly one in the top right corner for Vision Game Exchange caught my eye because the address is literally 2 minutes away from my house. I looked up the retail unit and sadly the game store is long gone, but the store is now a charity retail shop for St Gemma's Hospice, which is a well-known Leeds charity, but it's always sad to see another independent games store being long gone. This month's Club 64 letters are quite funny, with a lot of people writing in with freakish glitches that they've come across in games. The best letter, however, comes from Phil Cheng, who writes a complaint letter saying that he sent in cheats that were published, but they gave the prize and credit to another person. He then goes on a rant about the magazine being biased and making up letters, as well as saying that they wouldn't print this letter because they're hiding the truth from people. The magazine rightly sets him straight and says it's most likely that the GoldenEye cheats he sent in were also sent in by someone else who just happened to get in there first and win the prize. Invention Corner on the next page is awesome and yet kinda creepy. One fan sent in a controller adapter which would have a real gun pointed at you, and so if you got shot in the game it would actually fire real bullets at your face. Well, I don't think Nintendo would be interested in that idea. However, the other idea is a controller with a screen in the middle. Almost looks like an early Dreamcast with a VMU, or dare I say it, Nintendo Wii U control pad, years before this was released. There's a quick ad here to subscribe to N64 Magazine, but as that's now no longer active, you may wish to subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, click the like button, knock on my front door, kidnap my wife, hold her to ransom and take all my money. Directory is the roundup of every game's scores that they've ever reviewed in the magazine, including import titles. Nagano Winter Olympics and NBA Hangtime are the most expensive games, with a recommended retail price of £65, which was just insane. This month's featured investigation is what chemistry makes a great game. They use the magazine's categories which they use in their own game reviews to give an overview as to why they feel that the key elements for making a great game are what they're reviewing based against. They also use real N64 games which have been released to date to give some examples of excellence in those categories, as well as examples of games which have failed miserably in those areas. I also love how they highlight the inclusion of secrets in a game as having gone from being a nice bonus in the SNES era to what many people would now consider to be a prerequisite for a great title in this era. I feel this is important too, and something which many fans, myself included, always get a kick out of either finding ourselves or even using magazines such as this to find new areas or locations that I wouldn't have previously seen in a game. So that brings us to the end of this month's issue. In the next episode of the magazine, we'll be traversing to all corners of the globe and Warwickshire to bring you the latest news, and most importantly, they'll be coming back from the States with all of the latest that they found out from this year's E3 event. So as always, thanks for watching, and until next time.